We often speak about the 4 Ps of marketing in a consumer business. Every time we talk about FMCG, it's price, place, promotion, and product. But you know what? It's the 5th P that impacts all these 4. And that 5th P is politics. The Sitapati brothers. Sudhir is an FMCG veteran and Vinay is an academic expert on politics. Between the two of them, they have 3 books written, all of them bestsellers and among my favorites. So it was only fair that I sat them down to discuss the impact political regimes and policies and elections have on consumption. It's important to track ahead of so many state elections and the central election next year. This is The Weekender on CNBC-TV18.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining in. Sudhir, I have to tell you, FMCG is life, but I read Half Lion much before I knew of you at HUL and thereafter at Godrej Consumer. How does that feel?
Well, he's the more famous Sitapati, so it's natural.
And you're
He's the richer Sitapati.
I must say that CEO Factory as a book was inspired by Vinay, so I think you should ask Vinay how he wrote Half Lion first.
Speaking about Half Lion, you know, Narasimha Rao, not many know about the person. How did that subject fascinate you? How did you write that book?
Well, so I am not Telugu and I didn't know much about Narasimha Rao other than the joke that he knew how to be silent in 10 languages, right? So these were the jokes about him. But, you know, I was doing my PhD at Princeton University and I was getting more and more interested in India changing in the 90s. Something changed. I remember standing in line when the first McDonald's came to India in the mid-90s.
I remember.
So there was something there, right? And then I read a biography of Deng Xiaoping and it was a fantastic biography of Deng, his life and the life of China changing in the 80s. And I said, wait a minute, this is the parallel of India in the 1990s and the Prime Minister happened to be Narasimha Rao. All his negatives, his affairs, his corruption I talk about, but I also talk about the fact that in my opinion, he was the greatest Prime Minister in India. And so I then, you know, started, you know, meeting his family after, you know, they met me many times and they said, listen, you know, finally, you know, we trust you. And his youngest son, Prabhakar Rao, took me to his terrace or to the rooftop, which was closed, to say that, look, there are about 45 cartons here. These were my father's private papers. And I sort of, you know, supplemented that with about 100 interviews. The benefits that liberalization has given us was not inevitable. And even today, as we are pushing for more economic reforms, more liberalization, technocracy ain't going to do it. So there was no new thinking in the early 90s. What was new was the political ability to implement. And I think that your viewers especially, they focus on economics, they focus on the stock market. My only request is that don't write politics out of the story.
On the other side, there was a parallel track in your elder brother who was, you know, was finding his footing in the FMCG industry at that point. What were the changes there? How did consumption pattern change during liberalization post that?
You know, I joined the FMCG industry in the late 90s. And the early 2000s, paradoxically, due to liberalization, was actually a tough period for FMCG. And in hindsight, we realized that a lot of consumption went into telecom. I mean, then, of course, you know, after 2005 and 6, for a decade, there was a lot of growth in FMCG and that market boomed. And things are very, very different today when I look at the FMCG industry and consumer consumption today versus what they were in 1999.
Policies and politics, how do they impact consumption? Do you have any empirical evidence from both your experiences on that?
So one is, you know, are the policies pro-growth, pro-welfare?
Right.
So, you know, what Revdi culture versus GDP culture. But there's a third element, which is inflation. So, you know, you can have policies that, you know, increase consumption in, say, rural areas like the NREGA did. But we also know from the UPA time that had a huge effect on inflation. So that's the complex metrics. And even when you look at Prime Minister Narendra Modi, what he's trying to ask is, you know, should I spend on capital expenditure? Today, it may not bring benefits. 10 years from now, a highway brings benefits. How much should I spend on Revdi? It brings me elections results in the next 4-5 years. And in doing so, what are the consequences on inflation? And it's this complex balancing where politics, policy, and economics kind of play together that every Prime Minister is dealing with day in and day out.
I think between 91 and 2000, the FMCG industry saw a boom. That was led by supply chain factors, licensing, you know, industry being delicensed, you know, cost of production falling, etc. Then surprisingly, between the late 90s and 2005, when GDP growth went up, for a period FMCG actually saw slower growth, because as GDP went up, people started consuming different things. Then for another decade, we saw a lot of broad-based growth in FMCG, perhaps to do with things like MNREGA, etc., etc. And over the last few years, we have broadly seen a trend of premiumization.
That mean that, premiumization was a function of growth-related policies, capex-heavy budgets, and mass consumption was a factor of, say, the MNREGA scheme and people having more money in the hands. Would you?
Yeah, but I think in addition to that, I think that is correct. In addition, I think premiumization has to do with the fact that the state just gets out of the way. So yes, the nature of state spending, whether it's in capital expenditure or it's in revenue, does make a difference in who is consuming. The core idea in 1947 was that India is backward, its villages are backward. We need a strong state in order to push India into modernity. Post 1990, the ideological shift, which whether you're Manmohan Singh, Narasimha Rao, Deve Gowda, or indeed Narendra Modi, is that look, the state has to be a supporting actor. It cannot be the primary actor in the economy. I think that itself has led to a lot of premiumization.
Where we are right now, how do you view the consumer sentiment in the country at this point in time?
As things stand today, I think a lot of people are speaking of the K-shaped recovery, the top 20%, e-commerce, modern trade doing well, rural, small towns under a little bit of pressure. But I think it will change. I think these are all the ups and downs that you have in any business. I think the bigger story is that India has about 25 to 30 years of very, very fast consumer FMCG growth left in it, given where consumption is today.
From your business standpoint, what was it that you learned from him?
So, if you look at his books and the way he writes his books, he writes his chapter titles first, he writes a précis on each chapter, and then he writes the books. That's a very useful way of thinking in business, which is to have hypothesis first. A lot of us are fact first, and then you're like swimming in an ocean of facts. The other alternative approach which Vinay follows in writing books is hypothesis. You make up your mind, and as the data comes, you change your mind. So you got to be flexible on it. You can't like make up your mind and not change your mind. When I was asked to interview for Godrej, I first wrote my hypothesis down on Godrej.
Got it.
Then I asked Nisaba to send me some data on Godrej. Then I refined that hypothesis. Then when I joined Godrej, I spent 2-3 months traveling around Godrej and I refined that hypothesis. And then after I've still got that original hypothesis. The thing that I'm not sure I always do, but the thing that I certainly you have to keep in mind is that you cannot get dogmatic about hypothesis.
Yeah, you cannot be in love with your own original assumptions.
What is it that you're witnessing over what's happening in the country right now with from a Godrej business standpoint?
The way we look at our Godrej businesses is, regardless of the short term, providing you believe in the long term, you got to develop categories far and ahead of the natural rate of growth of those categories. And therefore, what we need to do in Godrej is get this business to double-digit volume growth. If India was not on a broad secular growth, then this would be different. But given the fact that you're on a broad upward trend, there are plenty of categories having lots of growth. The job for us in Godrej is to develop categories so that we trump the economic growth that is up or down in any given year.
Do you think over the last few years, this job of developing categories which are likely to grow ahead of the market in general has been, perhaps outsourced or taken up by a lot of the new age entrepreneurs who are looking at alternate channels, the D2C brands, etc.?
I would certainly say there have been many categories, a lot of them in e-commerce, D2C, technology, but also otherwise, that have innovated really well and taken a share of growth. So a lot of the time we think about share of market, you have to look at share of consumption. And if you look at share of consumption, you have to innovate so that your share of wallet goes up compared to others. I would certainly say that some categories have done it much better than many categories in FMCG.
What would then you do to perhaps bring that growth to those categories? Acquisition was one of them. We saw that with the Raymond consumer business. What are the other things that you're doing?
Two things. One is you got to innovate and get new products out into the market. And second is you got to, after getting a new product, it takes a long time for it to build, So you have to bet behind these innovations, which I call market development, for a long period of time for them to take off. Like a great innovation has been Magic Hand Wash, which has been a powder to liquid hand wash. We've had recent success in a good innovation called cockroach anti-roach gel, which is a gel that you stick in various parts of the houses, and when you come back the next morning, all the cockroaches that were there all over the house, including hidden corners, die, and that's had really explosive growth. Our air care category has really ridden this theme of premiumization really well. So there are plenty of categories in Godrej and GCPL, both in India and the rest of the world, which are trumping GDP growth and growing faster than that.
How important do you think is the 2024 election for you to decide where to put the next dollar in?
80% of our growth is driven by what we do, and 20% is what is driven by the macro. So rather than spending all your time thinking about the macro, it is better for you to think about what you can do.
The next few months have a bunch of state elections, all leading up to the big central election. How do you view the situation right now?
I think there are two basic changes when it comes to state versus center. One is, especially under Mr. Modi, the two have become delinked, where the central government is seen as a referendum on Modi personally, whereas state elections are seen as much more a referendum on state issues, state performance, a lot of local level factors. So I think that's one huge delinking that has happened. So I think the big message there is that whatever the state election results, they should not be seen as a semi-final for next year, because that delinking, especially under Mr. Modi, is quite strong. The other thing is that you're seeing something closer to a pro-incumbency effect than before, which is unique when it comes to state elections in particular. So I would say these are the two takeaways, and the big one is that don't see this as a semi-final. Think about the national elections separately and with a separate set of factors than these.
Post 2014, do you think the underlying tonality of politics has moved? People are speaking the language of success of Mr. Modi, where he speaks about development, he speaks about all these factors. Now you have other political parties speak about that as well.
Yeah, but you know, I wouldn't put it down only to Mr. Modi. There's been a general trend over since, I would say, 1991, where there was an emphasis that development works. I think Mr. Modi's genius is that he is the best marketeer of this product. Whereas, you know, I think other political parties, especially the Congress, are like, listen, if we talk about development too much, do we look at as pro-rich? But I think Mr. Modi's ability to give a singular message, a very clear message, is what makes him seen as Mr. Development. But frankly, it's an all India story. And as you said, many state governments are also singing the same tune.